Hello, and welcome to the Abuse and Neglect Prevention, Critical Incident, and Human Rights Annual Recertification Training. This is Module 2 that will help you understand how to report abuse and neglect. Training Overview. Be prepared to adjust the volume on your computer to listen to this training. To enable closed captioning, press the CC button in the bottom left or right of your video display screen. This learning path contains multiple components in the form of videos and quizzes. To be marked complete for this training, you must complete all modules and pass all quizzes, in addition to completing the final attestation form and mandatory reporter sign-off. Training objectives. Learners will understand the reporting process for suspected abuse and neglect for victims of various ages and dependent upon the location the incident occurs. Receive the overview of the abuse registry, and understand the role of a mandatory reporter and the expectations in their position with DDS or as a DDS qualified provider. Before we begin, a reminder that you are a mandatory reporter. This is a requirement of your job at DDS and for every person providing support to individuals funded by the department. Regardless of your title, you are a mandatory reporter. This means reporting abuse and neglect 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, not just when you are at work. It also means that you don't have to have proof. You may be a witness, meaning you saw it or heard it. Even if you suspect it, you should report it. And if you hear about it from someone else, you also must report it. It is not an option to report suspected abuse and neglect. As a mandatory reporter, your failure to report suspected abuse or neglect can be reported as neglect itself and may lead to progressive discipline. Any and all types of discipline may be considered depending on the severity of the abuse and neglect that was not reported. To elaborate on the Connecticut General Statute 46A-11B, allegations should not be called in just because a supervisor tells an employee to do so or as a means of covering one's own best interest. There must be reasonable cause to suspect abuse or neglect on the part of the reporter. The reporter should be prepared to explain their reasonable cause to AID Central Intake and any other agencies as necessary as to why they think there was abuse and neglect. Reasonable cause is not intended to discourage people from calling if they suspect abuse or neglect is taking place. If you witness or suspect abuse and neglect, the first thing we do is stop it. Next, we want to intervene and protect the victim, obtain any necessary medical treatment, support the victim, and lastly, report and document. As you know, this module will provide you information on how to report abuse and neglect. Here on the screen is a photo of the reporting handout that outlines the authorized reporting agencies, which we will dive into in the next few slides. The first agency to know, which was highlighted on the previous screen, is AID, the Abuse Investigation Division. All allegations for persons with an intellectual disability or any person who receives services from the Department of Social Services Division of Autism Spectrum Disorder Services for abuse physical by nature, sexual, psychological, verbal, financial exploitation, or neglect. The AID Central Intake phone number is 1-844-878-8923. When calling AID to make a report of suspected abuse or neglect, it is important that you speak directly to an investigator. Leaving a voicemail does not complete your responsibility as a mandatory reporter. If you call and leave a voicemail, you should leave a callback number. The AID phone system does not record phone numbers. You will also need to either leave your name or, if you wish to remain anonymous, indicate that you are a mandatory reporter who wishes to remain anonymous. You should receive a call back from an investigator. If you do not hear back within 1 business day, you should call again until you get a call back or you speak to an investigator directly. Other reporting agencies that you may need to call in addition to AID, depending on the victim's age or the location in which the incident occurs, include DCF, DSS, and/or DPH. DCF is the Department of Children and Families. DCF should be notified in addition to AID if the victim is 17 years of age or younger, or is an individual who is 18 to 21 and receives DCF services. The phone number for DCF is 1-800-842-2288. DSS is the Department of Social Services. DSS should be notified in addition to AID if the victim is 60 years of age or older. The phone number for DSS is 1-888-385-4225. Lastly, DPH is the Department of Public Health. If abuse or neglect is suspected at a DPH licensed facility or by a licensed practitioner, DPH should be notified in addition to AID. There are two separate numbers to note for reporting to DPH. If you are making a report for suspected abuse or neglect that occurred at a DPH licensed facility, for example, an ICF facility like Southbury Training School or Hartford Regional Center, the Facility Licensing and Investigation section should be notified. That phone number is 860-509-7400. If the suspected abuse or neglect is against a DPH licensed practitioner, then the DPH practitioner licensing and investigations line should be notified. This phone number is 860-509-7590. Remember, AID should always be notified. In addition to one of these agencies, if the victim's age is under 17 or 60 and over, and/or if the incident occurred by a licensed practitioner or at a DPH licensed facility. Calling DCF. If you have reasonable cause to suspect abuse and neglect of a child, which is a victim under 18 years of age or an individual who is 18 to 21 and receives DCF services, there are some additional steps to remember. First, you must report child abuse or neglect to the DCF care line within 12 hours. Next, you will want to locate the DCF 136 form on their website. This is a form that is required by DCF to be completed after making a verbal report to the DCF care line. Once you have located the form, it's important to complete this and send it to the appropriate location indicated on the form within 48 hours. Lastly, it's important to remember that after calling DCF for a victim 17 and younger or 18 to 21 that still receives DCF services, you must also report to AID, the Abuse Investigation Division. Some reporting rules to review. It is your responsibility to report allegations of abuse and neglect to the appropriate place depending on the age, type of situation, and location of the alleged victim. First, the person who has reasonable cause to suspect abuse or neglect should call the designated agency, AID, or other agencies if applicable. The report should be done as soon as possible, ideally before the end of your shift. Next, the reporter should notify their supervisor that a report of abuse or neglect has been made. If the supervisor is not available, or you have reported your supervisor of abuse and neglect, follow the chain of command. For example, report to your supervisor's supervisor. If the caller wishes to remain anonymous, they do not need to notify their supervisor. However, the failure to report to a supervisor when a report has been made to the DDS AID Central Intake or other authorized agencies having jurisdiction over the reporting of allegations of abuse and neglect based upon the age of the victim shall not constitute a violation of this procedure, if it is determined that such failure to inform the supervisor was for an authorized reason. Once a report has been made to the appropriate agency or agencies and they have notified their supervisor, they should then provide a written statement. This is per the Connecticut Statute 46A-11B. A 255 incident report form should be completed. Section 2B should be marked as other and written in as an unusual incident for verbal and psychological abuse and financial exploitation. Per Connecticut statute, a written report should be completed within 5 calendar days. While the Connecticut statute states that you have 5 calendar days for the written report, DDS employees and funded agency employees should complete the 255 form by the end of their shift. Especially if the report was made at an ICF facility. It needs to be completed by the end of the employee shift because the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services requires an investigation to be completed within 5 days. To reiterate, best practice would always be to complete all reporting by the end of the shift. When making a report, you're expected to be truthful and cooperative. It is important to keep the report confidential and not talk about the allegations with other coworkers or individual. Be respectful to the victim. This is not something that should be gossiped about amongst colleagues. It is also important that if any medical information or personal information needs to be provided or sent to a doctor, investigator, or supervisor, you should do this through fax and not by email to protect the confidentiality of the individual. If you are ever unsure about a situation, you can call your regional liaison for guidance. Per the Connecticut statute, Title 46A-11B, any person who obstructs, hinders, or endangers any person reporting an investigation of abuse or neglect or providing protective services, or who makes a report in bad faith or with malicious purpose, and who is not subject to any other penalty, could be fined up to $500. Lastly, it is very important to let the investigators do their job. After making the report, it is not your job to do an investigation. Supervisor's responsibility. Supervisors have additional responsibility when a report is made. A supervisor cannot interfere with someone making a report and should assist the employee in doing so properly if assistance is needed. The supervisor should not screen, evaluate, discourage, or refuse to allow you to file a report. Supervisors must be aware of abuse that rises to the level of criminal activity and notify the local authorities. Supervisors should assist all employees with completing the 255 incident report form and make sure the reporting employee gets a copy. It is not the job of the supervisor to make the verbal report to the agency or agencies on the staff's behalf. As a mandated reporter, the person that witnessed or suspected abuse or neglect is responsible for making the report. Supervisors should also not do any kind of investigation. This is the job of the authorized agencies. Reporting anonymously. When making a report of suspected abuse or neglect, you do have the option to report anonymously. If you choose to do so, it is important to identify yourself as a mandatory reporter who wishes to remain anonymous, make the report immediately, ideally at the end of the shift, be clear and detailed in the information you are providing to the investigator. Anonymous means that your name will be kept out of the investigation, except where disclosure is otherwise required by law. The reporter must complete a written report as a follow-up per the Connecticut statute 46A-11B after calling the appropriate agency or agencies. The 255 form should be used by all DDS employees and private provider employees and should be filled out at the end of the shift. The PA6 form should be used for the written report if the report was made by an individual that is not a DDS or DDS funded provider employee. While DDS policy does allow you to report anonymously, if you choose to do so, keep in mind that the reporter and the investigator does not know the appropriate names of people to interview, and this could drastically impact the investigation process. For the best interest of the individuals that DDS and qualified providers support, it is encouraged to provide your name for follow-up, but you are not required to do so. Per Connecticut statute, a written report should be completed within 5 calendar days. While the Connecticut statute states you have 5 calendar days for the written report, DDS employees and funded agency employees should complete the 255 form by the end of the shift. This is the best practice. The 255 form, the incident reporting form. The form that should be used for all DDS employees, DDS private provider employees, and CCH IFS providers is the 255. Here on the screen is the 255 form. It is also known as the incident reporting form. This form is used to report things like falls, bruises, and moderate or severe injuries. Other things that may be reported on the 255 are things like challenging or changes in behaviors. It is used to document and track whether these are from accidents, unknown injuries, or suspected abuse or neglect. The four major categories of incidents that are required to be reported: injuries, unusual incidents, critical incidents, and the use of restraint. If something that falls in one of these four categories occurs, it is your responsibility to complete this form. Information is used by individual planning and support teams to develop a person's individual plan and overall quality of services they are receiving. It is also your responsibility as a DDS employee or a DDS private provider employee to complete this form as a follow-up written statement to the verbal report of abuse and neglect. If the suspected abuse or neglect results in an injury, for example, physical by nature or sexual abuse, then the injury should be noted on the form. If the suspected abuse and neglect is verbal, psychological, or financial exploitation that does not result in physical injury, other should be marked for abuse and neglect allegations under injuries. The portion of the form that is directly applicable to reporting suspected abuse and neglect is Section 3, which is circled here on the screen in red. Important areas to complete on the 255. Here is Section 3 of the 255 form at a closer look. When you report abuse or neglect, the following information should be included: a summary of your comments of what you observed. If additional space is needed, the back of the form can be used. You will need to put your name and your title. You will need to put your relationship to the individual. You would check yes if abuse or neglect is suspected. You would note the date you phoned in your report and to which agency or agencies you reported it to. And lastly, you would sign the form. Where do I send the 255? If a DDS employee or private provider employee uses the 255 as a written statement for follow-up of their verbal report of abuse and neglect, that form needs to be sent to AID. The form can be sent via email to dds.aid@ct.gov or by mail. It is important to note that if you are emailing this form with the individual's information, the email should be sent encrypted for privacy. If the 255 was used to report an injury or incident that occurred in addition to abuse and neglect, then the form should be sent to AID and the region reporting team via email or fax. That contact information is displayed here on the screen. The PA6 form, abuse and neglect reporting form for non-DDS employees or private provider employees. Per the Connecticut General Statute 46A-11B that we've referenced before, it is reporter's responsibility to provide a written statement after calling an agency to report abuse and neglect. The form that can be used for non-DDS employees or private provider employees is the PA6 form. For example, if a family member, doctor, or dentist calls to report an allegation of suspected abuse and neglect against a caregiver to an individual, to provide a written report as a follow-up, they would use the PA6 form. Here on the screen is what the PA6 form looks like. The important parts of the PA6 that should be completed when providing a written statement are: The name, date of birth, address, and telephone number of the alleged victim of abuse or neglect. The date of the suspected abuse or neglect. Name of the name of the suspected abuser if it is known. The form should also include the reasons the reporter believes the victim to have an intellectual disability, information supporting the victim's inability to protect themselves from abuse or neglect, and importantly, information regarding the extent of the suspected abuse or neglect and any supporting information. Lastly, the name and address of the person reporting should be included, as well as a number where they can be reached. If a person wishes to remain anonymous, this form can be completed, and the reporter may fill in the agency name as opposed to their name and mark Y or N where it asks if you wish to remain anonymous. This form should be completed whenever there is alleged abuse and neglect. If there is an injury or incident, the 255 must be completed in addition to this form. Where do I send the PA6? Once the PA6 is complete, it should be sent to dds.aid@ct.gov or mailed within 5 business days of the verbal report being made per the Connecticut General Statute 46A-11B. Note that all emails with individuals' information should be sent encrypted for privacy. The DDS Abuse Registry. You should know that having a substantiated abuse or neglect complaint against you has severe consequences, one of which is your name being added to the DDS Abuse Registry. This is a confidential list of names that is accessible to employers licensed or funded by DDS for the strict purpose of making employment decisions. The DDS registry is not available to the public. Your name is added to a statewide abuse registry, and you cannot be hired by DDS or an affiliated agency. A person whose name has been added to the list for substantiated abuse and neglect can appeal their name on the registry by writing to the commissioner no more than 5 years after the substantiation and 2 years after their name has been added to the list. A reason someone may appeal their name being added to the registry may be for unfair termination or for good cause shown. The DDS Commissioner's Office will make the decision if the person can be removed from the registry. As we wrap up, remember that you are a mandatory reporter, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, not just when you are at work. This is a requirement of your job at DDS and for every person providing support to individuals funded by the department. Regardless of your title, you are a mandatory reporter. That means reporting abuse and neglect 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, not just when you were at work. It also means you don't have to have proof. You may be a witness, meaning you saw it or heard it, or even if you suspect it, you should report it. Also, if you hear about it from someone else, you must report it. It is not an option to report suspected abuse and neglect. As a mandatory reporter, your failure to report suspected abuse or neglect can be reported as neglect itself and may lead to progressive discipline. Any and all types of discipline may be considered depending on the severity of the abuse and neglect that was not reported. To elaborate on Connecticut General Statute 46A-11B, allegations should not be called in just because a supervisor tells an employee to do so or as a means of covering one's own best interests. There must be reasonable cause to suspect abuse or neglect on the part of the reporter. The reporter should be prepared to explain their reasonable cause to AID Central Intake and any other agencies as necessary as to why they think there was abuse and neglect. Reasonable cause is not to discourage people from calling if they suspect abuse or neglect taking place. It's now time to take your Module 2 quiz. You must receive 100% on the quiz in order to move on to Module 3 of this training. If you have any questions, please contact the training division at DDS or a training representative at your agency for additional information. This training is the property of the Connecticut Department of Developmental Services and should be used for training purposes only. This material should not be sold or used for profit. Thank you for your time today. If you have follow-up questions, please reach out to the training department at DDS by using the email address dds.training@ct.gov.